Hello everyone, welcome to Shadow Files. In this channel, we explore the world's strangest mysteries, unsolved cases, and hidden secrets. Let's begin. On a cold afternoon in February of 1957, a young man was walking through a patch of woods just outside Philadelphia, checking the rabbit traps he'd set days earlier. He wasn't expecting to find anything except maybe a rabbit. What he found instead was a cardboard box, half hidden in the underbrush, and inside that box was the body of a small boy. He didn't call the police that day. He'd later admit why. He was afraid they'd confiscate his traps. So for one more day, that boy lay alone in the woods, with no one in the world yet knowing he was there. When police finally arrived the next day, they found a child between 4 and 6 years old, naked, severely beaten, malnourished to the point that his body looked closer to that of a 2-year-old. His hair had been roughly and recently cut, so recently that loose clumps of it were still stuck to his skin. Whoever this boy was, somebody had hurt him badly for a long time, and then somebody had driven him out to a quiet patch of woods in the middle of winter and left him there like trash. Investigators were confident, almost certain, that someone would come forward within days. A missing child. Surely a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, a teacher, somebody would recognize him. Nobody ever did. Not in days, not in months, not in years. It would take 65 years, a small army of detectives across multiple generations, a private society of forensic experts, and a scientific breakthrough nobody could have imagined in 1957, before this boy finally got his name back. This is the full story of the boy in the box, also known for over 6 decades as America's unknown child. To understand this case, you have to understand the city it happened in. Philadelphia in the 1950s was a booming, dense, working-class American city, full of row homes, trolley cars, corner shops, and tight-knit neighborhoods where, in theory, everybody knew everybody. Fox Chase, the neighborhood where the boy was found, sat on the northeastern edge of the city, a mix of quiet residential streets and patches of undeveloped woodland, the kind of in-between area common to American cities expanding outward after the war. On February 23, 1957, a college student attending nearby LaSalle College was in the area, by his own admission, hoping to catch a glimpse of girls at a residential school nearby. While wandering through the brush, he noticed what looked like a discarded doll poking out of a box. He kept walking. It didn't register to him in that moment that he'd just seen the body of a real child. It wasn't until the next day, February 24th, that a 26-year-old man checking animal traps in the same area actually stopped and looked closely. What he found stopped him cold. A small, lifeless body, wrapped in a cheap blanket, stuffed inside a box that had once held a baby bassinet from a J.C. Penney department store. He panicked. He didn't call the police. He would later admit, and this detail still unsettles people who study this case, that his first instinct wasn't fear for the child. It was fear that police would take away his animal traps if he got involved. He went home. He told his priest the next day, in confession, what he'd seen. His priest told him, in no uncertain terms, that he had to report it to the police. So a full 2 days after the body was first discovered, the man finally called it in, and even then, he reportedly told police a slightly different story about how he'd found the box, to avoid admitting why he'd actually been in the area. When patrolmen finally arrived at the scene on February 25, 1957, they found exactly what the trap checker had described, a large cardboard carton lying on its side. Inside, a small boy's body wrapped in a cheap, faded blanket. He was naked. His skin was pale. He'd clearly been there for some time before anyone found him. The lead detectives on scene knew immediately this was one of the worst things they'd ever encounter in their careers. None of them could have imagined it would still be unsolved when most of them were long retired or dead. The medical examiner's findings were disturbing on almost every level. The boy was estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old, though his body, weighing only around 30 pounds and standing roughly 40 inches tall, looked more like that of a 2-year-old. Doctors found clear evidence of what's sometimes called arrested growth, a sign of prolonged, severe malnutrition. His body was covered in bruises, old ones healing alongside fresher ones, suggesting a pattern of abuse that had gone on for a long time. not a single violent incident. The official cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, consistent with being severely beaten. There were other details that genuinely puzzled investigators. His hair had been cut recently and crudely, so recently that loose strands were still on his body. His fingernails had been carefully trimmed. Whoever had done this had in some strange way tried to clean him up and make him presentable, even while disposing of him like discarded property. This detail, the careful grooming combined with the brutal violence, became one of the most chilling and debated elements of the entire case. Investigators also found something else: surgical-looking scars on his ankle, his groin, and an L-shaped scar under his chin. These weren't injuries from the abuse. They appeared to be healed, deliberate surgical marks, suggesting the boy had undergone some kind of medical procedure at some point earlier in his short life. That detail would become one of the threads investigators chased for decades, hoping a hospital or doctor somewhere might remember treating a child matching that description. His feet and one hand were described as pruny, wrinkled, as though he'd recently been in water for an extended period. Some investigators speculated this meant he'd been bathed, possibly right before he died, possibly as part of whatever violent incident ultimately killed him. Put together, the picture investigators were forming was horrifying. A child who had been abused for a long period of time, possibly kept hidden from the outside world, possibly subjected to some kind of medical care alongside the abuse, and then, after his death, deliberately cleaned, groomed, and disposed of in a way that suggested whoever did this wanted him gone, but perhaps also felt some twisted obligation to make him look presentable one last time. In the days immediately after the discovery, investigators were optimistic. This wasn't a case where a body had been hidden so well it might never be found. This was a city, with thousands of residents, where surely someone would recognize a missing child. They were wrong. Days passed. No calls came in identifying him. So the city escalated. The Philadelphia Inquirer printed 400,000 flyers bearing the boy's likeness, an almost unprecedented effort for a single missing persons case. Those flyers went out everywhere, tucked into every single gas bill mailed across the city, posted in train stations, handed out at grocery stores, pinned to bulletin boards in police precincts as far away as other states. To understand the next chapter of this story, you need to understand a strange and fascinating organization called the Vidocq Society, named after a 19th century French detective considered one of the founding figures of modern criminology. The Vidocq Society is a private club based in Philadelphia, made up of active and retired homicide detectives, FBI profilers, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and psychologists. They meet regularly, famously over lunch, to review cold cases that law enforcement agencies bring to them, offering fresh eyes and decades of combined expertise on cases that have stalled. The Boy in the Box case became one of the Society's defining causes. Co-founder William Fleischer described visiting the boy's grave personally, saying he could feel, in his words, that the boy knew he was loved and missed, and that the Society was determined to eventually put a name on that headstone. In 1998, the Society pushed for the boy's body to be exhumed for the first time, hoping new DNA technology, still in its early stages at the time, might offer answers that simply didn't exist back in 1957. He was reburied afterward at Ivy Hill Cemetery in a plot donated specifically for him, with a proper headstone for the first time in over 40 years. In 2016, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created a new, more advanced facial reconstruction of the boy and entered him into a national database, another attempt, decades later, to give the public a face that might trigger someone's memory. Still, year after year, nothing concrete emerged. Over the decades, dozens of theories surfaced, some taken seriously by investigators, others dismissed almost immediately. It's worth walking through the most significant ones, because each reveals just how desperately people wanted to solve this case. The most disturbing theory came in February of 2002 from a woman who used only the pseudonym Martha, or sometimes just M. She came forward claiming that, in the summer of 1954, her parents had purchased a young boy, whom she said was named Jonathan, from his birth parents. According to her account, The boy was kept largely hidden, subjected to severe physical and sexual abuse for roughly 2.5 years. She claimed that one day in early 1957, her mother was attempting to bathe the boy after he'd vomited, lost her temper, and beat him to death. She said she later accompanied her mother to the location where the body was left. This wasn't dismissed outright. Investigators who interviewed her described her account as troubling, plausible in some respects. But she also had a documented history of significant mental illness, which made her reliability as a witness deeply uncertain. When police and Vidocq Society members investigated the home she described, neighbors who had lived nearby for decades flatly denied ever seeing a young boy living there at all. Forensic genealogy, decades later, would also eventually rule out any connection between her family and the boy's actual identity. Another dead end, but one of the most haunting ones the case ever produced. Another theory suggested the boy might have been raised as a girl for some period of his life, a theory based partly on his recent haircut and some ambiguous physical characteristics. Forensic artists even produced a reconstruction reflecting this possibility. It generated public interest, but, like so much else in this case, no confirmed identification. Investigators also looked into whether the boy might be a missing child from elsewhere entirely. One theory connected him to a 2-year-old named Stephen Damon, abducted from a New York grocery store in 1955. The age and general appearance seemed to line up until investigators discovered Damon had a documented broken arm before he disappeared, an injury the boy in the box did not show. Ruled out. There were theories involving traveling carnival workers passing through the area around the time of the boy's death. There were theories involving Hungarian refugees, reflecting the wave of immigration following the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. Each lead absorbed investigators' time and hope. Each one, eventually, went nowhere. In 2016, 2 independent writers and researchers, one from Los Angeles, one from New Jersey, believed they'd identified a possible match through a family connection in Memphis, Tennessee. They worked for years to get DNA samples compared. By December of 2017, the results came back. No match. Another theory, another dead end, after years of effort. Even the man who originally found and reported the body, Frederick Benonis, came under some scrutiny over the years simply because so little else made sense. He voluntarily took a polygraph test and was cleared of any involvement. He'd spend the rest of his life as something of a minor, uncomfortable footnote in a tragedy he stumbled into entirely by accident. Year after year, decade after decade, the pattern repeated. A promising lead, months or years of investigation, a dead end. By the early 2000s, detectives who'd worked the case as young men were retiring or passing away, having spent entire careers without ever learning this boy's name. For decades, the tools available to investigators were fundamentally limited to what existed in 1957: fingerprints, dental records, eyewitness memory, and pure legwork. But starting in the 1990s, a new science began to emerge that would eventually crack this case wide open: DNA analysis, and later, an even more powerful technique called forensic genetic genealogy. The first real attempt came in 1998, when the boy's remains were exhumed specifically so a tooth could be extracted for DNA testing. The technology at the time could confirm basic genetic information, but it wasn't yet capable of doing what investigators truly needed: connecting that DNA to actual living relatives. The real breakthrough technology, forensic genetic genealogy, had already proven itself in one of the most famous cold cases in American history, the identification and capture of the Golden State Killer in 2018. That same approach, combining DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research, would soon be turned toward Philadelphia's oldest unsolved case. In 2019, the boy's body was exhumed for a third time. This time, forensic anthropologists worked carefully to extract DNA in a form usable for modern genealogical analysis, though there was an enormous obstacle. After 60-plus years in the ground, much of the boy's DNA had badly degraded. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, a genetic genealogist who took on the case, later described the challenge as being like solving an enormously difficult puzzle with most of the pieces damaged or missing. It took roughly 2.5 years of painstaking work just to extract usable genetic data. Once that data existed, it was uploaded to public genetic genealogy databases, the same kind of services many people use casually to research their own family history. And then, something remarkable happened. A distant relative of the boy, a second cousin, once removed on his mother's side, had years earlier uploaded their own DNA to one of these databases, with no idea it would ever matter to a 65-year-old homicide case. That single match was the thread investigators had been waiting 6.5 decades for. From there, genealogists worked backward and forward through historical birth records, marriage records, and family trees, slowly narrowing down a specific family line that matched both the genetic profile and the boy's estimated birth year. Investigators eventually identified a woman they believed was likely the boy's mother. They approached her family directly, and her own first cousin agreed to submit a DNA sample to a public database for comparison. That sample confirmed the family connection investigators had been building toward. With a likely family identified, detectives obtained a court order for vital records, specifically any birth certificates for children born to that woman between 1944 and 1956. That search turned up a birth certificate for a baby boy born January 13, 1953, that also listed the name of his father. For the first time in 65 years, the boy in the box had a name on paper. The next step was making sure it was the right one. Investigators cross-checked the birth certificate information against the DNA evidence already gathered. Everything matched. After 65 years of dead ends, false leads, debunked theories, and generations of detectives who passed away without ever getting an answer, Philadelphia police finally, definitively, knew who this child was. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Genealogists had actually uncovered his name more than a year before it was made public, in October of 2021, but investigators spent additional time verifying every detail before going public, given how significant the announcement would be. On November 30th, 2022, the Philadelphia Police Department officially announced that detectives had determined the boy's identity. On December 8th, 2022, 65 years, 9 months, and 13 days after his body was found, Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw stood in front of cameras and said his name publicly for the first time in human history. Outlaw spoke about what made this case so uniquely painful. Not just that a child had been murdered, but that his entire identity, his rightful claim to his own existence, had been stolen from him for over 6 decades. William Fleischer of the Vidocq Society, who had personally pursued this case for a quarter-century, said it was an overwhelming mixture of emotions: sadness, relief, and finally, after so long, a sense that the boy could rest, knowing the world finally knew his name. Investigators also learned that Joseph had lived near 61st and Market Streets in West Philadelphia, a location roughly 15 miles from where his body was eventually found in Fox Chase. Remarkably, despite living in a populated city neighborhood, Joseph had never been reported missing by anyone. Police confirmed that both of Joseph's parents were deceased by the time he was identified, and declined to publicly name them at first to protect ongoing investigative work. They did confirm that Joseph had siblings, both on his mother's and father's side, and that some of those relatives were still living in the Philadelphia area, having had no idea for their entire lives of the connection to one of the city's most infamous cold cases. In January of 2023, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported the names of Joseph's parents: Augustus Zarelli, known as Gus, and Mary Elizabeth Plunkett, known as Betsy. For the first time, the boy in the box had a complete family story attached to his name, even if the most important question of all still remained completely unanswered. Identifying Joseph was an extraordinary achievement, the first time in history that forensic genetic genealogy had successfully identified remains this badly degraded. But identifying the victim is a very different thing from identifying the person responsible for his death. As of this recording, no one has ever been arrested or charged in connection with Joseph's murder. Captain Jason Smith of the Philadelphia Police Homicide Unit was direct about the challenge ahead, acknowledging that solving a 65-year-old homicide is an uphill battle, while emphasizing that detectives would do everything possible to pursue it. Investigators have said publicly that they have suspicions about who may be responsible, but have declined to share those suspicions, citing the fact that this remains an active, ongoing criminal investigation even today. Whether charges will ever be filed against anyone, especially after so much time has passed, and given that Joseph's own parents are both deceased, remains genuinely uncertain. We also still don't know, with certainty, exactly what happened to Joseph in the months and years before his death. The surgical scars on his body, the evidence of prolonged abuse, the careful grooming after death, these details paint a disturbing picture, but the full story of what he endured and who specifically caused it remains incomplete. What we do know is that for 65 years, an entire city refused to let him be forgotten. Detectives who never met him spent entire careers trying to find his name. Strangers left flowers and small toys at his grave for decades, with no idea who he was, simply because his story had become part of the city's collective memory. That, in its own way, is a kind of justice too, even while the larger question of accountability remains open. Joseph's case didn't just matter to the people who loved him, even though, tragically, none of them knew during their lifetimes that he'd been found. It fundamentally changed how cold cases are investigated, not just in Philadelphia, but across the country. Philadelphia's police department went on to establish a formal forensic genetic genealogy program directly because of the techniques developed and refined while working Joseph's case. That program has since been used on dozens of other previously unsolvable cases, some dating back decades, some far more recent. Forensic lab manager Gallagher, speaking after the identification, said plainly that while Joseph represented the first identification achieved through this collaboration, it would absolutely not be the last, and that the department's stated goal going forward was to ensure no homicide victim in the city remains unidentified again. On January 13, 2023, what would have been Joseph's 70th birthday, the city unveiled a new memorial at his gravesite. For decades, his headstone had simply read, "America's Unknown Child." Now, for the first time, it also carried his real name and his photograph, right alongside the words that had defined him in the public's memory for 2/3 of a century. Bill Fleischer of the Vidocq Society, reflecting on the moment, said it best, that Joseph Augustus Zarelli would no longer be that boy in the box. He would no longer be unknown. After 65 years, an entire city had finally kept its promise to him. There's something genuinely remarkable about this case that goes beyond the mystery itself. For 65 years, generations of detectives, many of whom died without ever learning the answer they'd spent careers chasing, refused to let this case fade away. Civilians who had no personal connection to Joseph at all kept his grave decorated with flowers and toys for decades. A private society of forensic experts dedicated enormous time and resources for free, simply because they couldn't accept that a child could be erased that completely. And in the end, it wasn't a confession, or a deathbed admission, or a lucky break in the traditional sense that finally identified him. It was patient, methodical science. DNA so degraded that experts called it one of the hardest genetic puzzles they'd ever faced, combined with a stranger, a distant relative, Joseph never knew existed, who happened to upload their own DNA to a database years earlier, with absolutely no idea it would one day matter. Joseph Augustus Zarelli would be around 70 years old today, if his life had gone differently. We'll never know what kind of life he might have lived, what he would have grown up to do, who he might have become, what kind of ordinary, unremarkable, beautiful life he was denied. What we do know is that he is no longer nameless. He is no longer just a tragic headline or an unsolved case file gathering dust in a records room. He has a name, a birthday, a family, and a place in the world that belongs specifically to him. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13, 1953. The investigation into who caused his death remains open today. If you have any information, no matter how small it might seem, Philadelphia investigators have made clear they still want to hear from you, even now, even this many decades later. But regardless of whether that final piece of the puzzle is ever solved, Joseph's case stands as proof of something important, that some people simply refuse to let a child be forgotten, no matter how long it takes. If this story moved you the way it moved me researching it, let me know in the comments. And if you want to see more deep, respectful dives into real unsolved cases like this one, this channel covers stories just like it regularly. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to learn Joseph's story. I'll see you in the next one. This is Shadow Files. Some mysteries are solved, but many still remain hidden in the shadows. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a mystery. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep searching for the truth.